So you're tuning into the deep dive because you're looking for something more than just a compliance checklist.
Right.
You didn't come here for the obligatory boxes to tick. You came for the philosophical foundation.
Hmm.
You need a deep understanding of the radical ethical stance that's required when your research is actually designed to critique power itself.
That really is the mission today. We are going to try and pull apart this often really sharp tension between traditional legislated research ethics, the procedures, the protocols,
Yeah, IRP forms.
the IRB forms exactly, all the things focused on minimizing risk and, let's be honest, maximizing institutional protection.
hmm
And the framework that is absolutely non-negotiable for what we call critical social science, or CSS.
Our sources make a really profound and I think challenging claim right at the top that we have to grapple with. They argue that the existing framework of research ethics often just provides an illusion of ethical practice. It's like ethical theater.
It is. And the stakes are just immense because we're not just talking about protocols here. We're talking about the nature of knowledge itself.
Okay.
I mean, the core question for this deep dive is really, how do we even begin to conduct ethical inquiry when we're forced to acknowledge that what currently counts as valid knowledge is already steeped in power dynamics, in systemic oppression,
Yeah.
and the heavy, undeniable influence of hypercapitalism and market forces.
That reframes the entire process from question to publication. So the source material we're looking at today provides this really deep critical examination of how ethics get defined and regulated inside the modern university.
Yeah, and we're looking at regulations that are heavily influenced by these traditional postpositivist orientations, and why that whole approach in all its different forms really fails the moral test that critical inquiry demands.
So let's start there. Let's start with the philosophical battleground that really set the stage.
So when we look historically at where our definitions of research ethics even come from, our sources confirm they grew out of all these diverse intellectual and cultural traditions. But as research became more regulated,
Especially after World War II, right?
yeah,
The need for real protections against abuse.
exactly. In the wake of those events, the framework that came to completely dominate the institutional approach was this traditional post-positivist orientation.
Okay, we hear that term post-positivist thrown around a lot in academic settings. But for our listener, what are the actual implications of that framework when you apply it to ethics? What's its core assumption?
Well, its core assumption is really rooted in this concept of value-free scientific neutrality.
Okay.
If you think back to classical social theorists, people like Max Weber or John Stuart Mill, in that view, science, the actual process of discovery, is fundamentally pristine. It's objective. It's neutral.
So the only ethical questions come up later.
And the only ethical concerns arise when someone decides how to use the results.
So the science itself is pure, and it's only the application of the findings that can be political or moral. That implies a really rigid separation between the methodology and the moral outcome.
Precisely. And this orientation, it seeks to establish universalist results, findings that can be generalized broadly across populations.
And often with the intent to, quote, save humankind or solve some global problem through a standardized, reproducible intervention.
Yes, exactly. And so ethics in this model often get reduced to just following these pre-designed methodological rules. It's a generalized imperative to just apply a uniform standard to everything.
And this is exactly where critical social science, CSS, just mounts its most forceful philosophical challenge. I really want to highlight the critique of universalism here. The source cites Foucault, who called a universalist ethic catastrophic.
Yeah.
Why? Why such strong language?
Because the effort to universalize an ethical code, especially one that's rooted in the history of the Western post-positivist tradition, it inherently ignores context. It ignores culture. It ignores power differential.
Of course.
If you legislate a one-size-fits-all ethical standard, what you're really doing is imposing the ethical sensibilities and, frankly, the power structures of the dominant group onto marginalized groups.
And that creates the illusion of ethical practice that we mentioned at the start. You check all the boxes, but you haven't actually engaged in any real moral dialogue.
That's it. In that light, the regulatory checklist becomes a tool of power. It forces compliance with a dominant intellectual framework rather than fostering any kind of genuine moral responsibility.
So for the critical social scientist, ethics can't be some pre-packaged, generalized set of rules that you just apply from the outside.
No, It has to be particularized. It
Yeah.
has to be continuously infused throughout the entire inquiry process, and it demands ongoing moral dialogue and critical consciousness from the researcher themselves.
So let's define the CSS alternative then. Our sources talk about critical social science, which, incorporates feminist, post-colonial, and postmodern critiques, as demanding a radical ethics. What makes it radical?
Well, it's radical because CSS is always and already centrally concerned with power and oppression. Its foundation is explicitly and inherently political. It's built on the intersection of power, privilege, oppression, human suffering, equity, social justice, and radical democracy.
So the research process isn't neutral. It can't be.
It's never neutral.
Okay.
It is either a means of liberation or it's a means of furthering oppression. There's really no middle ground.
Which means the research itself has to be relational, it has to be collaborative, and it has to align itself with resistance and with marginality. That is a massive shift from the image of the lone, objective scientists just observing the world.
And this leads us to challenge one of the most ingrained ethical traditions of that traditional view,
Yeah.
what's called the will to save.
Right.
Traditional social science sees its mission as establishing knowledge that generalizes to save humankind. But for criticalists, our sources explicitly call this will to save an imperialist imperative.
That is a fascinating and a difficult term. How does a good ethical intention, the desire to save lives or improve conditions, how does that turn into an imperialist imperative?
Because that ethics of good intentions often masks how embedded it is in what the sources call the Euro-American error.
Air.
Yeah, it's this unquestioned belief in modernist progressive views of the world that just assume this omnipotent ability and, frankly, the inherent right to know, to interpret, and to define others.
I see. So when a researcher from outside a community decides what salvation looks like for that community.
They're creating power for themselves, and they're simultaneously reinforcing the very oppressive conditions they might have set out to resolve.
So the researcher becomes the expert, the solution provider, the moral authority,
Yeah.
and in doing that, they inadvertently perpetuate that dynamic of the colonizer and the colonized.
Exactly. The ethical act of saving actually removes agency from the people being studied. And so the core mission of critical inquiry requires the researcher to reconstruct the entire purpose of inquiry itself.
So the purpose shifts. It moves from intervention and measurement to what?
To engaging in the struggle for equity and justice, while at the same time examining and countering the individual power that gets created for the researcher within that very context.
This means taking up, as the sources suggest, moral projects that decolonize, honor, and reclaim indigenous cultural practices. We see this in practice through models like the Mi'kmaq Ethics Watch, which I know we'll get into later.
And those models really illustrate the mandate. Research has to mobilize collective actions, and that results in a radical politics of possibility, of hope, of love, care, and equality for all humanity.
So the crucial ethical component here is avoiding the perpetuation of this inquirer-oriented power.
Right. We have to move past the idea of the researcher as a savior or as a decolonizer, or even as someone who merely empowers the subjects. The goal is simply to join with and learn from, not to speak for and intervene into.
This shift is huge, and it leads us to some of the more advanced, almost futuristic concepts that are mentioned in the sources, like Anthony Alessandrini's call for an ethics without subjects.
Mm-hmm.
That concept sounds highly abstract. I mean, how can you have research ethics without human subjects or objects?
It is highly theoretical, but it's also profoundly important for this critical ethical stance. And ethics without subjects it's a post-colonial, future-oriented ethical relationship. It's a commitment to being responsible not just to the people we study today,
But to who?
to would-be subjects that have not yet come into existence.
So a responsibility to the future. What does that, what does that actually look like in practice for a researcher who's, writing a policy brief today?
It means refusing to lock in any definition of the other. It means refusing to generalize your findings in a way that rigidly defines the future possibilities of a community. It's an ethics that avoids that kind of humanistic piety that insists on declaring, acceptance or rejection of a community's identity or their trajectory. It just accepts the future as unknowable and complex.
And therefore, it refuses to construct knowledge today that would limit the ontological possibilities of future generations.
Exactly. And if you refuse the status of subject or object for the participant in the first place, your research necessarily has to focus on systems and structures, which is an inherently more ethical approach. It avoids that power dynamic altogether.
That is a demanding philosophical position. It's moving from simple checklists to a kind of continuous moral forecasting.
And this radical philosophical stance becomes even more urgent when we introduce the contemporary sociopolitical conditions.
Okay.
Our sources argue that the current environment has reinvigorated the privilege of empire through these powerful neoliberal Western discourses
Yeah.
and just relentless regulatory technologies.
So we're moving from Foucault into the realm of corporate control. This is the context that's shaping how modern knowledge is produced in the 21st century.
Absolutely. The sources use this really powerful metaphor. The 21st century is constructed by the imperial court of corporate greed and knowledge control.
Wow.
And this court, operating within our contemporary sociopolitical environment, is the ultimate judge of what constitutes valid and reliable knowledge.
So how does this imperial court define valid knowledge? I mean, does it use peer review, rigor, transparency?
It uses only one metric, the entrepreneurial imperative.
It's just one.
Just one. Knowledge is judged valid and reliable only if it fits this imperative. And that means it has to foster privatization, competition, corporatization, and at the end of the day, profiteering.
So if your research doesn't contribute to that framework, it risks being labeled what? Irrelevant.
Biased.
Irrelevant, biased, or simply unproven.
So market logic has completely replaced moral or scientific logic.
Yeah.
The dominant societal discourses are so infused with this corporate fundamentalism that, as the source points out, questioning a failing corporation isn't the same as contesting the corporate forms of intellectual colonization itself. That's the critical distinction. Let's look at some of the specific examples the sources provide to illustrate how hypercapitalism has colonized not just our institutions, but our very ability to think critically, what they call the colonization of the mind.
Okay, let's do it. Start with the AIG example from the 2008 financial crisis.
Right. The whole discussion surrounding the bailout of AIG was framed by that phrase, too big to fail.
I remember it well.
The source argues that this framing is a perfect example of depoliticized corporate power. By labeling AIG as too big to fail, the discourse subtly reinforces the foundation of corporate power itself.
How so?
The implicit ethical statement is that the institution's economic survival is the highest moral good, that it overrides any need for accountability or structural reform or any moral critique of its predatory practices.
That's insidious. The economic imperative just instantly shuts down the moral or the political debate. And the source says the same thing applies to political discourse around public schools.
Exactly. Consider the political admonitions you always hear to raise standards in public schools.
Right. Sounds good on the surface.
It sounds positive on the surface, but this language actively avoids recognizing the structural inequities. Things like poverty, historical segregation, funding disparities that actually impede student performance.
So it avoids the need for actions that would broaden the definition of public education to focus on things like critical democracy and social justice.
Right. Instead, the focus is placed on a quantifiable, measurable output that fits perfectly with the corporate model of productivity.
It's using corporate language competition, free market choice, to depoliticize these massive structural issues, make them sound like they're just management problems instead of systemic failures rooted in injustice.
And this unchallenged language is infused into the fabric of everyday life. And that leads to this corporate colonization of the mind. We see this play out dramatically in education, particularly in post-disaster scenarios.
The sources cite the post-Hurricane Katrina environment in New Orleans, illustrating what's often termed disaster capitalism.
This is a devastating example. Immediately following the disaster, while the city was still reeling, there was this accelerated push for elitist public schools like Lusher that had previously been denied as inequitable under normal democratic conditions.
So the crisis provided the political cover to implement these radical free market educational models.
Precisely. And the charter school model is cited as a prime example of this corporate colonization within the education system.
Right.
The implementation of the charter school agenda, which had been rejected before when it was proposed as vouchers, is described as using the free market notion of public school choice to reinvigorate the power of the business roundtable.
And that brought in corporate turnaround models and massive profiteering directly into the public education sphere.
Right. And the ethical shift here is profound. Education is no longer a public good that's guaranteed by democratic consensus. It's a consumable, competitive commodity.
So given that context, how does the imperial court define success in research? If the goal is profit and efficiency, then the research has to be quantifiable.
It is. Western knowledge producers, combined with hypercapitalism, use constructs like evidence-based research, and standardized achievement tests to define success. And these tests, which are often created by multinational companies, they become the yardstick by which all human endeavors are measured.
And the ethical problem there is the reductionism involved.
It's worse than reductionism. It's subjectification through quantification. These constructs, they decontextualize, they objectify, and they further subjectify students, teachers, and families.
Wow.
The profound ethical issue is the reduction of human beings to their scores. Human beings are treated as if their bodies, defined as achievement test scores, were the measure of what works.
So the language of measurement, efficient, indisputable, universal, it's just accepted as correct.
And in being accepted, it establishes a particular view of morality and equity that aligns perfectly with corporate interests.
That is just chilling, viewing a person's life and worth as an entry on a balance sheet. It's hard to imagine how a researcher who's often funded by or employed by these very systems can possibly maintain an independent ethical stance.
And that is precisely the mandate of critical ethics. It becomes an absolute necessity to conceptualize ethical practices as independent from and as a necessary challenge to hypercapitalism.
So what's the first step?
A critical ethics has to cultivate a consciousness that's aware of the sociopolitical condition and aware of one's own self-productive reactions to the dominant disciplinary and regulatory technologies. We can't just accept the truth of a superstructure, like neoliberal economics, as always dictating human existence. That consciousness is the first step toward any kind of internal ethical transformation.
That need for consciousness brings us directly into the territory of Michel Foucault, and specifically his concept of governmentality. But before we dive into the critique, let's just establish where research ethics are usually located today. Our sources identify 4 main locations.
Right. The 4 common locations where ethics are tied are, first, the ethics of entitlement. So, the researchers perceive right to know and categorize the other. Second is reflexive ethics. Those are the considerations that are embedded in qualitative methods, where the researcher self-reflects during data gathering. Third, you have communitarian ethics. So, socially negotiated values and moral commitments that are shared with the community.
And the last one is the big one.
And fourth, legislated regulation, the institutional reviews, like IRBs, which create that veneer of ethical concern.
And the key insight here from the sources is that all 4 of those locations are embedded in this idea of governmentality. Can you elaborate on Foucault's definition of that and how it applies to a researcher?
Sure. Governmentality is essentially the construction of technologies that govern populations and individuals. Foucault describes 2 main types of regulatory power. The first is what he calls regulatory power.
That's the external stuff.
That's the external, visible control of populations. Think legislated rules enforced by institutions. Your university's IRB guidelines fall squarely in this category.
And the second type?
The second is internalized discipline, which is the individual researcher's self-governance.
So governmentality is the external mechanism, and internalized discipline is the mentality. It's the way we adopt those rules and think about accepting control.
Yes, exactly. The external regulation, like the IRB, is often recognized and critiqued as an institutionalized form of governmentality. It's seen as a technology of power that constructs, limits, and generates these intersecting oppressions by setting the boundaries of what is acceptable inquiry.
But the more subtle and maybe more powerful form is that individual governmentality. This is the internalized discipline that's based on the desire to construct a particular self, the well-educated person, the good researcher, or the transformative activist. We police ourselves based on our desire to be a certain type of person.
And here we hit a really profound paradox for critical social science. CSS is fundamentally dedicated to critiquing oppressive governmentality. Yet, the very act of constructing a critical ethics, the critical desire for counter-colonial solidarity, or a commitment to anti-oppressive research, that itself represents a form of individual governmentality. To construct a critical ethics is to address one's own mentality. Any belief structure, no matter how flexible, serves as a discipline and a regulation of the self.
So even the striving to be ethically good is a way of governing the self.
Yeah.
How do we navigate that? I mean, if we critique all governmentality, how do we justify having our own critical ethical framework?
Well, we have to realize that there is no escape from internal discipline. The key is which governmentality we submit to.
I see.
We have to consider both forms, the self and the institutional population, when we're constructing an ethical CSS.
Yeah.
So while CSS challenges the institutional notion of governmentality as a truth structure, We also have to acknowledge the power of institutional expectations and the contemporary regulatory context that we are all forced to navigate.
And the dominant institutions we work in are certainly not operating from a critical perspective. They support these modernist, male-oriented, and imperialist forms of governmentality. They're built to privilege a certain kind of individual and a certain kind of knowledge.
That's the persistent challenge. These institutional structures use ethics that are often legislated or constructed from value systems that maintain two core interconnected assumptions. First, that objective science can solve all problems, which justifies intervention into other people's lives.
And second,
And second, that free market capitalism will improve life for all, which justifies specific research choices focused on efficiency and measurable outcomes.
and these pervasive structures, they underpin the dominance of neoliberal economics and ensure that even if CSS is striving for relational and collaborative research, the system continues to orient power toward the individual, objective researcher.
Therefore, the sources argue for developing a sophisticated, robust, doubled individual governmentality. We have to avoid universalist codes, but at the same time develop a fiercely robust individual ethical framework. The researcher must be both an instrument in the critique of power and a collaborative agent, using the master's tools, the individual self, for the purpose of radical critique and transformation.
Okay, developing that doubled governmentality, being both a critical instrument and a collaborative agent, that requires profound internal work.
It really does.
Our sources turn to Foucault's concept of the ethical axis to explain this process. The goal is to avoid self-absorption and conduct a continuous genealogy of the self along the axis of truth, power, and ethics. We're focusing on the ethical axis here, which requires an intensification of the relation to oneself.
An intensification of the relation to oneself. It sounds like deep psychological and moral work, and that is exactly what it is. This is the practical core of radical ethics for the individual researcher. It's a process for ethical self-construction that moves way beyond compliance and into a genuine moral becoming. And it has four essential components.
Let's break down these four pillars of transformation, starting with the first one. 1. Ethical substance, the moral grounding. What exactly is the moral grounding that legitimates the critical self?
So ethical substance is the raw material of morality. It's that which allows or disallows self-deception and acts as the grounding for your ethics. It is, as Foucault suggests, that which enables one to get free from oneself.
And the substance is context-specific.
Very. For ancient Greece, it might have been the unification of pleasure and desire. For the critical researcher, it is the deeply held, internalized belief in the tenets of critical social science itself, a belief system that actively addresses oppression and constructs solidarity and alliances with those who have been traditionally excluded.
So for the critical researcher, the subject matter of critique becomes the moral foundation of the self. And the sources provide incredibly specific content domains derived from the work of Joe Kincheloe that can construct this ethical substance. This is the bedrock of the ethical researcher, so we should probably go through these in some detail.
We absolutely must, because these 10 points move the conversation beyond just vague aspirations and into actionable ethical commitment. They really define the content of the critical researcher's moral grounding.
Okay, let's take the first one. Analysis of the dynamics of competing power interests.
This means the researcher must internalize a commitment to always view any situation, any policy, any interaction, not as a simple exchange, but as a contest between competing power groups.
So ethically, this means you can never accept a neutral description of a conflict.
Never. For example, if you're studying an educational reform, you have to ethically ground your analysis in the interests of the administrators, the teachers, the parents, the students, and, crucially, the multinational test makers. All of them are competing for control, for resources, and for the narrative.
Okay. Next, exposure of forces that inhibit the ability of individuals and groups to determine the direction of their own lives. This seems to overlap a little with the first point.
It does, but it focuses more on agency and self-determination. The ethical substance here is the commitment to reveal hidden barriers, not just external constraints, but internalized forces or assumptions, things like meritocracy or colorblindness, that prevent self-governance. Your research is ethically bound to expose the structure, not just the symptom.
The third domain. Research into the intersection of various forms of domination.
This rejects siloed research. The ethical self recognizes that oppressions are never singular. Racism, sexism, classism, and ableism are all interwoven. So the moral substance means the researcher must ethically refuse to study gender, without also examining race and class simultaneously, understanding that a poor indigenous woman experiences oppression through an entirely different lens than an affluent white woman does.
Number 4. Analysis of contemporary forms of technical rationality and the impact they have on diverse forms of knowledge and ways of being.
So technical rationality refers to that logic of efficiency, measurement, and objective control that hypercapitalism just loves. The ethical commitment here is to constantly question this logic.
For example,
For example, why is a high p-value in a statistical analysis considered superior knowledge to the deeply contextual local knowledge held by a community elder? Technical rationality often invalidates non-Western or indigenous ways of knowing, and the ethical substance must be ready to challenge that hierarchy.
5th, examination of forms of self-governmentality, always recognizing the sociopolitical and sociocultural context.
This is about meta-awareness. The ethical substance compels the researcher to examine their own disciplined self. Why am I framing my research questions this way? Is it because my committee demands it, or because I truly believe it's the most ethical approach? This requires a continuous inventory of one's own internalized pressures and how they relate to the broader socio-political context.
Number 6, inquiry into what could be, constructing a critical immanence that moves toward new, more equitable relationships while avoiding utopian rationalities.
The ethical commitment here is the ability to maintain hope and possibility without resorting to unrealistic rationalist utopias. It requires what you might call practical vision.
Right.
If your critique simply stops at identifying oppression, it's incomplete. The ethical researcher is compelled to use their inquiry to point toward achievable, radically democratic, and equitable alternatives, a politics of possibility that's actually grounded in reality.
7th, exploration of the continually emerging complex exercise of power as hegemonic, ideological, or discursive.
This demands a lot of sophistication in the researcher's understanding of power. Hegemonic power is the dominant cultural consensus. Ideological power is the set of beliefs that maintain that consensus. And discursive power is how language shapes what is considered acceptable truth. The ethical substance insists that the researcher has to understand all three and how they intersect in their specific field of study, refusing the simplistic notion of power as just a clear chain of command.
We're almost through Kincheloh's content domains here. Number 8, examination of the role of culture in the contested production and transmission of knowledge.
This recognizes that all knowledge is culturally situated. The ethical commitment is to dismantle the idea that Western scientific culture holds the only valid means of producing knowledge. It means studying how different communities, indigenous, immigrant, marginalized, produce and transmit knowledge, and then ethically advocating for the inclusion and validation of those diverse epistemologies within the academy.
Number 9, studies of interpretation, perception, and diverse vantage points from which meaning is constructed.
This is fundamental to qualitative inquiry, but it's elevated here to an ethical mandate. It compels the researcher to ethically prioritize multiple perspectives, especially those that have been traditionally excluded. Interpretation is never neutral. The ethical substance forces the researcher to constantly question whose interpretation is being privileged and whose is being suppressed by their research design.
And finally, number 10, analysis of the role of cultural pedagogy, how culture itself functions as education, often producing hegemonic forms of interpretation.
Right. Cultural pedagogy is the realization that we are constantly being taught by our media, our institutions, our policies, our social practices. The ethical self recognizes that these cultural lessons often reinforce hegemonic interpretation. So the researcher has to be committed to exposing the hidden curriculum of society, how culture teaches us who is valuable and who is not.
That is a comprehensive and, frankly, a demanding framework. So accepting these 10 domains as one's moral ground, as the ethical substance, that leads us to the second component of Foucault's ethical axis. 2, mode of subjectification, the rules accepted. What obligations does the individual submit to based on that critical substance?
The mode of subjectification dictates the rules the researcher accepts for themselves. So if the ethical substance is the why, the mode is the how. If Kincheloh's domains are your moral foundation, then your mode of subjectification must reject the fundamental power dynamics of traditional research.
Which means rejecting the entitlement to know others.
Exactly. The critical mode is responsive and flexible, and it prioritizes anti-oppression. It explicitly rejects that sense of entitlement and recognizes the alienation that's created when an individual is placed under the observational, critical gaze of the researcher. Furthermore, this mode would prioritize accepting communal decision-making, True, deep collaboration over rationalist, top-down forms of negotiation. The researcher has to continuously ask, how are these self-imposed critical rules being acted upon in my research choices, in my collaborations, and in the way I educate others?
Next is the 3, ethical work, the method of transformation. This is the self-criticism required to change oneself into an ethical form. This sounds less like methodology and more like ontology, a change in your very being.
It is an ontological transformation. This work requires continuous, rigorous self-criticism that historically examines one's own constitution, how the researcher was shaped by the very systems they now seek to critique. It's about revealing the conditions under which one questions the self, invents new ways of forming relationships, and constructs new ways of being. This moves way beyond simply being a good academic to becoming a genuinely ethical person and researcher.
And critical pedagogy provides the practical tools for this ethical work, right?
It does. We see concepts like socio-individual imagination, which is the ability to conceptualize new forms of collaboration and rethink subjectivities, acknowledging that your professional and personal life are interwoven social justice projects.
Okay.
Another key element is mobilizing desire, constructed as a radical democratization. It's about joining the efforts of the excluded to gain access to civic life, rather than just studying their exclusion from a distance. The ethical work turns the researcher into an active participant in their own transformation.
Finally, we arrive at the 4th and arguably most challenging component. 4, telos, the willingness to disassemble self.
Telos is the commitment to deconstruct one's world and one's research practices to avoid constructing power over any individual or group, even future unpredictable others. It's the constant willingness to be wrong, to let go of comfortable assumptions, and to decenter one's own authority. It's a form of self-bricolage, slowly establishing a self that's committed to thinking differently, to welcoming the unknown, and to functioning flexibly.
And this telos is crucial because it helps create those pathways for the ethics without subjects, that post-colonial perspective we talked about, the one committed to the future and actively avoiding the continued colonialist construction of the other.
Yes, it means giving up the ego and the authority that are associated with being the one who knows. By understanding this individual ethical axis, the sources show how even the master's tools, the individual self-governance and academic authority, can be used for fundamental critique and transformation. A critically ethical self is simply better prepared to engage with the conflicting ethical messages and regulations within institutions, allowing them to transform academic spaces from within.
So we started this whole deep dive by critiquing legislated ethics as creating an illusion of ethical concern. Now, having constructed this radical internal ethical self, let's revisit those institutional regulations. The sources argue that legislated regulation is not just insufficient, but can be actively damaging.
Yeah, because it assumes a universal cultural grounding that just doesn't exist.
Right, that cultural grounding is vital. Regulations often assume a Western legal and social context, an Anglo-Saxon framework of privacy, individual rights, consent. That simply doesn't translate ethically when you impose it on non-Western or even marginalized domestic settings. Can you elaborate on the detrimental impact that's cited in the sources?
Certainly. Marzano's work from 2007 showed that attempting to impose Anglo-Saxon ethical research regulation in an Italian setting, with medical patients involved in qualitative research, could actually be detrimental to the participants.
How so?
The required anonymity and the procedural distance actually damaged the necessary therapeutic and relational trust that had been established within that specific cultural context.
And a similar issue came up with confidentiality in a different setting.
Yeah. Tilley and Gormley in 2007 showed how the construction of confidentiality, as we understand it in a Western legal sense, created challenges to individual integrity in a Mexican setting. The expectation of individual legal confidentiality conflicted with the deeply embedded communal and relational structures of that community. Legislated forms of governmentality just cannot possibly address these particulars. In fact, they actively harm the research relationship because they're culturally deaf.
And I think our listener who might be grappling with an IRB right now needs to hear this. If this misalignment between legislated rules and local reality happens internationally, how is this playing out in their own domestic institution, maybe within a marginalized community?
Well, it plays out through the bureaucratization of trust. The IRB requires standardized consent forms and processes, which often strips away the time needed for genuine, slow, relational trust building that's necessary for ethical CSS research.
So it substitutes a legally enforceable signature for true moral commitment.
Exactly. The critical ethical researcher has to recognize the IRB process as a bureaucratic hurdle to be navigated carefully, but never mistake it for the actual substance of their ethical responsibility.
So, if IRBs and universal rules fail the test of radical ethics, what are the counter-colonial models for research that align with the ethics of the marginalized? We need models based on true partnership and accountability.
The Mi'kmaq Ethics Watch, described by Batiste and Henderson, is a really powerful example of a model that just flips the power dynamic. They constructed research guidelines where any inquiry must be an equal partnership.
And what's the crucial part?
Crucially, the Mi'kmaq people are the guardians and interpreters of their intellectual and cultural property, and they review research conclusions for accuracy and sensitivity before dissemination. The researcher is accountable to the community's own ethical self-definition.
This radical ethical stance accompanying communities, rather than testing, knowing, or judging them, leads to a fundamental transformation in how we even conceptualize research itself. The ultimate goal, as Denzin suggests, is to eliminate the need for human subjects in many cases.
Right. If a critical social science fundamentally refuses the notion that one group can know and define others, it changes the entire purpose of the research. Instead of focusing on the individual participant as a subject to be studied, the research questions have to pivot to societal structures, institutions, and oppressions.
That is a huge practical pivot for a researcher. Wait, so if I'm studying, say, educational policy in a specific district, are you saying I shouldn't interview teachers?
Yeah.
Where's the line? And what kind of research questions can I ask that completely bypass the ethical pitfalls of observing another human?
Well, the line is drawn when the focus shifts from the individual's deficit or experience as the problem to the structure's function as the problem. You may interview teachers, but the focus has to be on understanding the policy's mechanism of oppression, not on categorizing the teacher's behavior or competence.
Okay, can you give us some examples of research questions that shift the focus away from the human subject and toward the system?
Sure, we should instead examine the fundamental assumptions underlying the conceptualizations of public policy. We can analyze dominant ideologies in particular areas, like the ideology embedded in a standardized curriculum. We can study the forms of representation language, statistics, images that are privileged by those in power. If societal structures, institutions, and oppressions become the subjects of our research rather than human beings, we can avoid the further creation and subjectification of the other.
And that's where Denzin's suggestion to abandon the dirty word called research and adopt a critical interpretive approach comes in. It requires mobilizing activism within academic settings, challenging what counts as publishable and fundable research.
And this mobilization is vital. Critical qualitative researchers need to move this reconceptualized, broad-based critical social science to the center one that addresses institutionalized, policy-based, intersecting forms of power, includes alliances with counter-colonial positions, and involves that continuous, rigorous ethical self-examination.
And finally, looking ahead, the sources briefly touch on an emerging area of critique that forces us to move beyond the human entirely, expanding the ethical struggle even further.
This is the newest frontier. Nomadic conceptualizations of ethics, often called feminist new materialisms or post-human or more than human perspectives. This work recognizes the profound anthropocentrism that's embedded even in critical social science, which has historically prioritized human suffering above all else.
Right.
This new work introduces justice and equity concerning the environment, non-human animals, diverse forms of life, the non-living world, and the earth itself.
As Rissi Braidotti suggests, this requires researchers to rethink the knowing subject in terms of affectivity, interrelationality, territories, eco-philosophical resources, and forces. The critical ethical struggle is constantly expanding to encompass ecological justice alongside social justice.
It forces us to ask, if our ethical mandate is to disassemble the self to avoid constructing power over others, does others now include the climate, the non-human life forms we study, or the land we walk on? It is the logical conclusion of radical ethics. If power is inherent in all relationships, then ethical scrutiny must be inherent in all relationships, human or otherwise. #tagoutro.
This has been a transformative journey. I mean, we've moved far beyond the bureaucratic inconvenience of the compliance checklist and into the internal continuous ethical deconstruction that's required of the critical researcher.
Yeah, the core difference is this. Legislated ethics is about compliance to a preset modernist code that's defined by institutional self-interest. Radical ethics, the kind required by CSS, is about continuous, challenging self-examination, especially concerning the role of power, hypercapitalism, and your own privilege.
So it fundamentally moves research from being about knowing and saving the other to joining with them in their struggle.
That's it.
The ultimate ethical work is the commitment to disassemble the self, the telos, to ensure we avoid constructing power over any individual, group, or system today or in the unknown future. That willingness to dismantle one's own authority is really the measure of critical success.
It is the hardest mandate, and it's constant work.
So we leave you with this final provocative thought based on that commitment to telos and the need for continuous self-critique. If critical ethics requires a continuous genealogy of the self and a willingness to disassemble self to avoid power over others, what oppressive institutional practice or dominant piece of hyper-capitalist rhetoric must you first expose in your own field of knowledge to begin this ethical work? What is the first thing that needs to be fundamentally unthought in your professional life?